Little disclaimer up, this is meant to be taken as legal or tax advice. If you need legal advice or tax advice, we recommend that you talk to your legal counsel or your tax advisor. What's interesting about this one is what we're talking about is tax forms. I was telling a couple of my marketing colleagues right before we started today that when I was in law school, I walked into Federal Tax 101, sat there for about 3 minutes, went, nope, this is not for me, and walked right back out. Professor even kind of made fun of me as I did because I didn't want to be a tax attorney. And here we are talking about tax forms. We should be able to answer your questions if they're of general applicability. So if you have any, use that Q&A function and send them to us. And we'll try to touch on them. Generally, again, because it's a pretty basic structure when you get down to it, we should be able to answer most of them. But if it's something we can't answer, we'll let you know and we'll tell you to talk to your legal counsel, your tax advisor. So let's go over the basics in the background. First and foremost, we talked about this last year, just about every single time that we get a question, one of the first things we do is we go to the instructions, the 2023 Form 1084C, 1085C instructions.
Hey, Nick, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you share your screen again?
Oh, dear.
Yes.
Thank you, marketing.
Okay, that makes me feel better because I couldn't see it and I was just sending them a message.
I'm
Okay.
telling you, the change in Zoom, I'm not sure I'm loving it. Well, here we are. So again, you're going to want to go to the instructions. We have them linked here. You can also just Google 2023 1085C, 1084C instructions, and just about everything that you need will come from there. That being said, we understand that there are times where it's a little bit confusing. The language they use is kind of like a second language. And so we get the need to ask additional questions and do training like this. We also have this bullet up. I don't know if we'll use it next year, but we talked about it last year, and it's important to note that there is no longer good faith relief for 1084C and 1085C reporting. The IRS expects these forms to be perfect. They want you to provide accurate, complete information. Before they changed up that guidance, we were able to kind of go with the mindset of, hey, close counts, get it done, get it in. If there are issues, because as long as you made a good faith effort, you could just fix it. No longer the case. They want it to be perfect. And so if you do have some of these inaccuracies, your tax attorney could argue that you have a good, or that you have a reasonable cause reason. That's not a good way of saying it, that there's reasonable cause for you to have made the mistake or whatever, and that you should be penalized, but there's no guarantee that the IRS actually goes along with it. They might say, that's great, you should have known, you should have done this better, and they might still penalize you. So you want to do your best on these. The penalty for incomplete or incorrect filings is $310 per return, and that's doubled. So if you're doing one form to your employee, and then that same form is going to the IRS along with your 1084C, and it's incorrect, in theory, that's a $620 penalty for incorrect information that's been furnished. So we really want to avoid that. I haven't seen any of these penalties levied yet. Claire, have you seen any of those yet? Yeah, we haven't seen the IRS come down hard on anyone yet. But we're gonna.
I take it back, Nick. Maybe one.
And actually, as I'm saying,
yeah.
I think maybe one for myself as well.
Yeah.
But I think it was a pretty glaring issue where there was like nothing on line 14. We'll talk about line 14 in a second here. But that is an option for the IRS. So we really do want to do our best on this. And we'll talk about this again at the end. But one way to kind of go through this is, as you're looking at your 1095Cs, think about your employee population and think about, if you have different groups that are all going to be kind of similar, and take a sample size, 4 1095Cs from your full-time employees, 4 1095Cs from that population out in Idaho. That's a little bit different than everyone else. And look at the codes that we're going to go through and make sure that they make sense. Look for something that just looks out of place, because that's probably your best way of finding some of those inaccurate code sets or information that you'd be providing to the IRS. Let's talk about deadlines. This has to get to employees by March 1st of 2024. We have this in the later slide, but if you have employees in California, for their individual mandate, you're supposed to get out the information to them by January 31st. So California employees, you have a slightly accelerated requirement, but for everyone else, you're looking at about March 1st of 2024. And then you have to get it to the IRS by February 28th of the next year for paper filings, but very few of you are going to be able to do paper filings now. Now it's basically be March 31st for everyone else, because you're going to be required to do electronic filings, because the IRS has changed their guidance. They said that electronic filing is required for employers that file 10 or more returns. So if
And
you have more than 10 1095Cs, you're going to have to do electronic filing. And this applies to other forms that you might be dealing with, like W-2s.
yeah, it does. Well, I want to add one thing in here. Usually what happens with Nick and I, we deliver an internal version of this presentation to our staff, and then we take their suggestions and things that we learn in that, and then we try to make a better presentation for all of you. But in between, I also learned about another small vendor that is helping smaller employers that are going to be required to send this information electronically for the first time. So if you are a smaller employer and you are just now realizing you have to file this electronically, reach out to your Holmes Murphy experience team, because they're going to be able to provide you with some names regarding this. And Nick, we've got 2 questions in here. The first question, is this supposed to be in employees' hands on the 31st or postmarked? And
That's a great question.
it is a great question. And I would say that usually when you're talking about a postmark, we're usually going to have something specifically that says it can be postmarked by this time. We think probably should be in employees' hands, or at least on their computer screens by the 31st. I know.
Yeah.
I'm half and half too, Nick, because being postmarked by the 31st also says, okay, they could receive this. Yeah.
I have an idea.
Rule. It's the mailbox rule.
Let's have Lisa do a little bit of Googling while we're presenting here, see what she can find, because I'm not sure. I do not know. I would imagine that it would be a postmark rule, just because it's hard to guarantee that something's going to be in someone's hands. Once you send something in the mail, you have no control over it, but we'll have Lisa confirm that. There is a penalty if that deadline is missed in California. I haven't seen anyone hit with that penalty. I don't know how they would actually enforce that, but I think it's like a $50 per day violation type deal. And again, we can have Lisa.
Again, we'll check and get back with you on this.
Yeah. So those are the basics. Let's talk about the 1094C. We're not going to talk about the B forms today. The B forms are what your carrier partner would be sending out if you're fully insured, or if you're a small employer. So you have fewer than 50 full-time equivalents, and you're self-insured, you could maybe use the B forms. We're going to set that aside because that's not going to apply to the vast majority of you listening in. We're just going to talk about the C forms. And the first one we're going to talk about is the 1094C. There's not a ton of information on it, but it can be very, very important information. A lot of the 226J, ESRP, employer shared responsibility payment penalty notices that we see are as a result of incorrect information on a 1094C. So here's what the bottom of part 1 and part 2 looks like. This is kind of the most substantive information that we have on that first page, let's call it, of the 1094C. Line 18, total number of forms 1095C submitted with this transmittal. So that's going to be all the 1095Cs that you're sending with that 1094C. That's almost always going to be the same number as line 20. The only time that that's going to be different is if, for whatever reason, you as a single EIN do 2 separate 1094C filings with different 1095Cs. Then you will have 2 different numbers there. That's pretty rare. And for most of you, because it's going to be a single filing, then on line 19, you're going to check, yes, that it is the authoritative transmittal. Again, if you do more than one 1094C, at least one of them has to check the box that it is the authoritative transmittal. But for most of you, if you're a single EIN and you're reporting just for that EIN, that it's a 1094C just for that EIN, you're going to check this is the authoritative transmittal, and line 18 and 20 will probably be the same. Now, some of you, when I was saying that, said, well, what happens if I'm part of a control group? That's where you check yes on line 21. If you're part of an aggregated ALE group, that's just another way of saying a control group. And that's if you have brother, sister companies, you're a subsidiary, whatever it is, multiple EINs, all under a control group, then you would check box yes, or check the yes box, and then complete part 4. If you're not, if you're just a single employer, single EIN without any other control group members, you're checking no. Look at this. I have all these like fun little things right here, and I'm not even popping them up, Claire. We'll get rid of that rust, I promise. For line 22, when we get these questions, one of the questions we'll get is, hey, are we required to check box A, box D? Which one should we check? You aren't actually required to check either box. You will check box A if you're reporting using code 1A on your 1095Cs because you're offering minimum value coverage to employee, spouse, and dependents at or below the federal poverty line safe harbor. We'll go through those codes in a second here, but if you're using 1A, you check the qualifying offer method. If you're not using 1A, you're probably not checking that box. I can't think of any reason why you would. And then the other one is the 98% offer method. And with that one, it's just that, you know, if you're offering coverage to 98% of your employees, then you are able to check that and you have some limited relief in part 3 of the 1094C.
And a lot of you may have questions. All right, how is my coverage affordable? This is something that your Holmes Murphy team has gone over with you, except they probably did it so long ago that you can't remember. So you want to reach out to your Holmes Murphy experience team. The ways that coverage can be affordable, it's either affordable because it's at or below federal poverty line. It is at a specific percentage of your employee's rate of pay. Or it is at a specific percentage of your employee's W-2 wages. So those are the only options there. And you get a small benefit from, you know, checking off 1 or 2 of these boxes, but you're not really deriving a huge benefit. So it's not necessarily something that you have to feel positive or negative about if you do it or you can't do it.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that, especially with the 98% offer method in a second here. So this is what part 3 looks like. And this is where we see kind of the biggest, where we should have the biggest focus on getting correct information in on your 1094C, because when this is screwed up, that's where we get these massive penalty notices. And that's because column A, if you've offered coverage to 95% of your full-time employees for the entire year, please make sure that you are checking yes for all 12 months. If maybe you had a month or 2 where you didn't, okay, then it's okay to check no. But for most of our clients, they're making sure they're hitting that 95% mark. Make sure that you're saying yes. For whatever reason, some systems will automatically default to no, or it'll inadvertently happen. They'll say no, or they'll list a month as no when in fact it was yes. And so then the IRS gets that. If one employee went to the exchange and got a subsidy, that tells the IRS that you're then subject to a subsection A penalty, ESRP payment. And that's where we see those eye-popping numbers. So, you know, $10 million, $1 million, 120,000, whatever it is. And for the most part, the IRS has been good about allowing employers to go back to correct it and say, hey, actually, in fact, we did offer to 95%. Here's how we can show that we did. And the IRS said no penalty. However, remember what we were talking about earlier. They expect this to be perfect. They expect it to be correct. At some point, it's possible the IRS could start saying, okay, fine, you don't owe that huge penalty, but you still have to cut us a check for $310 because that's an incorrect 1094C filing. Haven't seen that yet, but it's possible. So we want to make sure, let's check it, avoid the heart palpitations that come with getting a notice from the IRS that you owe millions of dollars. Check it, make sure that you're checking yes if it does in fact apply. Columns B and C will have different numbers unless somehow you only have full-time employees. If you don't have a single part-time employee, then it's possible that B and C will be the same. But if you have any part-time employees, or if you hired employees that are in a limited non-assessment period because they don't count towards your full-time employee count or something like that, you're usually going to have different numbers here. Whenever I look at a 1094C part 3 and I see the same numbers in B and C, I think there's something probably not right here. Every once in a while it's correct, but we want to make sure that that accurately reflects your full-time employee count and then your total employee count. Column B can be left blank if you're utilizing the 98% offer method. Now, something that Claire brought up when we were doing this internally is most systems at this point default to putting in the number for both anyways. If it's defaulting to put in the number, there's really no reason to use the 98% offer method. You're gaining nothing from it, but we leave that up to you and your better judgment. And then column D is the aggregated group indicator, just telling folks that you are part of a control group, tell them the IRS part of a control group. It's usually gonna be for all 12 months. The only time that we'll usually see some sort of changes if there's M&A activity where a company that was part of a control group leaves the control group and is spun off, or vice versa. They are not part of a control group and they're acquired. They keep their EIN and they become part of a control group mid-year. When we're looking at the total employee count, you are including your part-time employees, even if you don't offer them coverage. That is part of that total employee count. And that was answering the question that was in the inbox there. And then when we think back to that, box where you're checking yes, that you're part of an aggregated ALE group. Well, if you do that, then you're completing part 4. And here you're just listing the other control group members in descending order according to size. If you run out of space, you do not have to attach an additional sheet. But for most of you, you won't have more than 4 or 5 other control group members. And I guess
know that we've had people say, oh my gosh, I completed it the wrong way. I did ascending size, or I didn't realize that it had to be in descending order. Obviously, it's best to do what the IRS wants. And I'm not sure how far they're going to take this absolute perfection that they are requiring. But just keep that in mind as you're filling this out.
Yeah. But that does bring up, and I should just hammer this home real quick, each separate EIN within a control group is going to do their own 1094C with their accompanying 1085Cs. So if you have a company where there's 4 EINs in there, each one is going to do its own 1084C, and they're going to have their own batch of 1085Cs. Well, someone can do it on behalf of each company, your reporting guru, whatever it is, that's fine. However, you need to make sure that each one has its own separate filing. And before we move on, I'm going to answer this question live real quick. Company has 60 plus EINs. That's amazing. If there are penalties, will it be kept to each EIN, or will it open up the entire group? Nope. When we're looking at the employer mandate penalties, they are assessed on an EIN by EIN basis or employer by employer basis. And so if one group happens to not hit their 95% mark or has some subsection B penalties, that is levied just with that EIN. And then if you are not part of a control group, if you're a single employer, you do not have to complete part 4. Now let's talk about the 1085C. Here we have part 1 and part 2. Part 2 is the most substantive part. I mean, part 1's pretty straightforward, right? You're going to provide the employee's information, the ALE's information. It's pretty standard stuff. But then when we get into part 2, that is the meat of the employer mandate enforcement for the IRS. This is where they get their information that they're able to cross-reference based on the information they get from the exchanges when people go get a subsidy to see whether or not you owe a subsection B penalty. So let's start with line 14. Do not leave any month for line 14 blank. You have to have a code in there, and that's because if the employee wasn't employed with you, you have to tell the employee, or not employed with you, if you didn't offer them coverage, you have to tell the IRS that you didn't offer them coverage. If you offer them coverage, you should have the corresponding code for that. 1E is going to be the code that most of you use. If you're offering minimum essential coverage, that's minimum value to the employee, spouse, and dependent, and it's not at or below the federal poverty line, so you're not using the 1A code, 1E is going to be the code that you're going to use for just about all of you. If you do something a little bit different, we'll have a slide up in a second here that'll touch on some of the other codes, but 1E, if you're offering coverage, is the one that you're going to use. Be on the lookout for code 1H in line 14 without a code on line 16, because that indicates that no offer of coverage was made, and that you don't have a reason for not offering someone coverage. So if you have 1H for a month when you had offered someone coverage for the full month, because you're only doing an offer code if it was offered for the entire month, you want to change that over. You don't want to have a 1H saying that you didn't offer coverage when you did offer coverage for the entire month. Line 15 reflects the lowest cost minimum value self-only coverage offered to that employee. It does not have to reflect the coverage the employee actually has. So if someone elects your Cadillac plan, it's super expensive. You're not reporting that cost. You're reporting the lowest cost self-only minimum value coverage that you're offering to that employee. Changes in the cost of coverage should be reflected. If you do a premium reduction mid-year, or you do a premium increase mid-year or something like that, that should be reflected on line 15. And the only time that line 15 is left blank when you're making an offer of coverage to someone is when you're using the qualifying offer method. If you're offering coverage at or below the federal poverty line, you can leave line 15 and technically line 16 blank as well. You will have some systems that will default to putting information in. They'll put in line 15 and line 16, even if you're using 1A. I have not seen anything that states that that's non-compliant. You're just providing more information than you have to. And then, Claire, do you want to answer a question before I go on here, or should I finish with line 16 before we answer some of these questions?
Go ahead. I'm typing the answer to one more question.
Okay.
So, and then we can go to the others that are still open, but I have not a complicated one, but a little bit lengthier one I'm responding to right now.
But maybe we can discuss whatever that one is, if there's some common concepts in there that would help everyone else at the end. Line 16 tells the rest of the story, right? So line 14, we're telling the IRS whether or not there was an offer of coverage or not. Yes, there was. Here's the 1E. No, there wasn't. Here's the 1H. If there was an offer of coverage, line 15 is saying, hey, here's the cost of coverage. And then line 16 tells the rest of the story. Was the employee in a waiting period? Was the coverage offered affordable? Was the employee enrolled in coverage? So on and so forth. By putting in a code on line 16, the IRS knows what's going on. However, it is possible that line 16 has no code in it. If you have someone that is employed with you, and you don't have anything in line 16, that's basically telling the IRS, hey, we didn't offer them coverage, or we did offer them coverage, but they didn't take it. So we don't have a 2C in there. We'll talk about that code in a second here. We don't have a 2C. We don't have an affordability safe harbor. We don't have anything else. That indicates to the IRS that you are now susceptible to paying a penalty if that employee went to the exchange and got a subsidy. For some of you, that was intentional. You might have looked at the employee and said, we're going to offer them this coverage. It may not be affordable. So we're going to leave line 16 blank, telling them, hey, we didn't offer them affordable coverage. We know we didn't. Or it might be a full-time employee that for whatever reason, you decided not to offer them coverage. For some of our clients, they have interns that are full-time employees. They don't use a look-back measurement period or anything like that on their interns. So the intern is just a full-time employee. They said, we're not offering them coverage. And that means that they'll put in line 14, 1H for all 12 months. And then on line 16, for the months that they're employed with them, they're just going to have a blank space. And if that intern happened to go to the exchange and get a subsidy, then they're telling the IRS, hey, we may have to pay a penalty for that individual because they were a full-time employee that we didn't offer coverage to. Be sure to review the line 16 codes that you used. Does that correctly reflect what's going on with your employees? Are you using the correct affordability safe harbor? You know, if you're using the rate of pay safe harbor, look for that 2H. We want to see that 2H. If someone's on your plan for the entire year, make sure you have that 2C for all 12 months. You want to look at that code and make sure that it makes sense. And that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where take those samples and look at them and see if they all look the same. If you start seeing random codes in there, then something's probably gone wrong. We need to fix that. It's amazing how we can look at a batch of employees that are pretty much the same and how sometimes we'll see different codes. And there, you know, the red flag goes up and we say, all right, we need to take care of something because this isn't looking right. Talked a lot about these codes. And here we have this kind of cheat sheet. Of course, we'll get these slides out so y'all be able to see that. But we go through kind of the most common ones you have. And I haven't read the ones that we see the most frequently. For instance, 1E on line 14 with 2C on line 16. Minimum essential coverage, that's minimum value, is offered to the dependents and spouses of the employee, and the employee enrolled in coverage. So the 2C is telling the rest of the story. It's saying, hey, 2C tells the IRS that the employee enrolled in the coverage. Right below that, well, we don't have it in red. For those of you that are using the rate of pay safe harbor, here's another common one we see where it's 1E on line 14, or we offered a minimum value, minimum essential coverage that was offered to the employee, spouse, and dependents. The employee waived the coverage. So we'll have a number on line 15 for that cost of coverage, whatever it is for your lowest cost self-only coverage. But we shouldn't be penalized, IRS, because we are able to use the rate of pay safe harbor. And we're telling you that by using 2H on line 16. So the 1E, 2H is again making this kind of affirmative statement of we've offered affordable coverage. We should be good. Another common one that you'll see is 1H, 2A. 1H is no offer of coverage, but then 2A is simply stating we shouldn't be penalized because that employee wasn't employed with us for that month. You can't be penalized for an employee that wasn't your employee during that month. So 1H, 2A is a good one. And then 1H, 2D is another one where we didn't make an offer of coverage, but that employee was in a limited non-assessment period, meaning they were in their waiting period. They were offered coverage mid-month. So they weren't offered coverage for the entire month, or they were in a look back measurement period for part of the year. And so that's why they're getting the 1H2D. And one thing I do want to note, and I should have probably put this in another slide, is if someone is in a limited non-assessment period or isn't employed with you for their entire time period of employment or whatever, they do not get a 1095C. So if you have an employee that's in their look back measurement period and they never qualify as a full-time employee and they're not covered under your plan, then they do not get a 1095C because they've never qualified as a full-time employee for you during the year. Every once in a while, you'll see those pop up. Go ahead, Claire.
A couple of things. First of all, it's not the end of the world if your vendor software creates a 1095C for that person, showing first, okay, they were not employed, and then they were employed, but they're in their limited non-assessment period. So you'll see a lot of that, right? It's not bad. It just doesn't have to be done. That's one thing. But Nick, I think we had a great question, and now would be a good time to answer it. This is one of our open ones. If we pay the difference on the plan because the employee doesn't make enough, do we still enter on line 15 what the minimum rate is or what the employee is actually paying?
And I would say it's what the employee is actually paying because that's the cost to the employee.
Yep. I would. Usually what you are entering is the cost of the employee only coverage, no matter what coverage the employee actually signed up for. But in this case, because you are making it affordable, yes, I would say you're going to have to stop that for those employees and put in what the employee is actually paying.
Yeah, because you've done a premium reduction for that plan for that employee.
Yep.
These are great questions.
Oh, we're just about to talk about COBRA. This is for Katie's question.
and I hope everyone will give us just 2 extra minutes at the end here. These are our last couple slides. So with the 1085C and COBRA, there are some special rules there. If you're reporting for the year when a full-time employee terminates employment during the year and elects COBRA. So I was employed with you. I have my 1E, $150 on line 15, and then my 2C, and then mid-year I retire, whatever it is. Then for that first full month when I'm not covered on your plan, it's 1H on line 14, no offer of coverage. Line 15 is blank, and then line 16 is going to be 2A, employee not employed during the month, or 2B if for the month of termination if coverage does not go through the end of the month. So it's going to be that either 1H, 2A, or 1H, 2B. If your coverage goes through the end of the month, it's going to be 2A. And then from there on out, it's 1H, 2A, unless they come back and work for you. And then part 3 of that 1085C for our self-insured clients is going to be where they put in the information if they elected COBRA, showing that they had coverage. For some of you that have self-insured plans, if you have employees that were not employed with you during 2023, but they had COBRA coverage through you, you have to get that information to them. And so what you're doing there is you're putting line 1G in line 14 for all 12 months. And that tells the IRS this employee was never employed with us for the entire year. And then you're leaving line 15 and line 16 blank, and then you're just completing that part 3. And that's letting the IRS know that you're covering a non-employee in 2023, in this case through COBRA. And then for reporting COBRA where it's a reduction in hours, which is rare due to stability periods, it's a little bit funkier. You're going to use the code that applies to the individuals that are offered COBRA. So if it's just an employee that has self-only coverage and you offer them coverage, you're going to use 1B. And if you look at the instructions, this is all spelled out 1B because that's offer of coverage, that's minimum value to employee only. And then you're going to put in line 15, the lowest cost of self-only coverage, and then 2C, if the COBRA, if they elect COBRA, 2B, if COBRA is not elected and the employee is not in a stability period, Or if they're in a stability period, you've offered them COBRA, you're subsidizing, and you have an affordability safe harbor, you can put in that affordability safe harbor, or you're leaving line 16 blank. For a lot of you, if you use the look back measurement method and it's a full-time employee that goes from full-time to part-time, they've had a reduction in hours, more likely than not, that employee is probably in a stability period. If they're in a stability period, they should be getting an affordable offer of coverage, and they should be treated like a full-time employee until the end of their stability period. So this shouldn't apply too often. This really just comes up for a lot of you where you have almost all full-time employees and you let someone go part-time for a little bit as they're approaching retirement, and you offer them COBRA. They're not in a stability period. They've lost eligibility. You're offering them COBRA. If it's just a single individual,
you want to answer? Did you, if I understand correctly, do we send a 1095C for a COBRA participant? Yes. Is this also a requirement for retiree coverage?
Yep, and that's where you can use, if you're pretty much just doing active employees and you have a retiree population, you can use your 1095Cs to do that, and that's where you're using that 1G, because they're not an employee with you. If they were a retiree for you the entire year, you're using that 1G code, not putting anything in 15 or 16, and then you're just completing part 3. We do have some employers that will use the B forms to report retiree coverage if they have a large enough retiree population. I don't know that there's necessarily a correct answer there. It depends more on what your reporting obligations look like for some of those populations. That's a good discussion that we could have with your HMA representative, and we can kind of get into that one a little bit further. But that's the point of that 1G code, again, is to report on the coverage that's being provided to non-employees.
All right, and we've gotten this question a couple of times, so I just want to clarify it. If your employee is offered coverage, so think back to the 1095C line 14. If they're offered coverage, right, so they've got a cover offer of 1E, but they waive the coverage, should you leave line 16 blank? Never, 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 never.
Unless it's not affordable.
Yeah, that's right. That's true. Unless it's not affordable.
If you're offering affordable coverage, then you're going to put in the affordability safe harbor code that applies.
Yep.
That's where we would put in that 2H for the rate of pay safe harbor, 2F if you're using the W2 safe harbor, or 2G if you're using the FPL, the federal poverty line safe harbor. So you should put in the safe harbor that applies if one applies. So you need to make sure that the rate of pay actually does apply.
Okay, great question. What if an employee, and I think this is what I would probably say here is please reach out to your Holmes Murphy experience team. But what if an employee passed away mid-October? What codes do I use for November and December?
Yeah, there I would just keep your usual offer code for October, and then for November and December, it's 1H2A.
Right, because they're no longer an employee.
Yeah. And then we'll touch on some more of these questions that are coming. I think we'll have a few. So for those of you that are willing to hang out, we'll answer more questions as they're coming in. But let's get this last little bit done for those that can't hang out. For the 1095C, you have part 3. And this is where only self-insured plans are completing this. And that's just showing if someone has coverage for a single day in any one of these months, you're going to check it. It's going to be for the employee, the spouse, dependent, anyone that's covered by your plan. If it's all 12 months, you check the all 12 months box. Otherwise, you're checking it by month for the months that they have coverage for at least 1 month. While we don't have the individual mandate at the federal level anymore, we still have it at the state level for some states. And some states rely on this form for the administration of their individual mandate. Massachusetts doesn't. Massachusetts has its own reporting obligations. If you have employees in Massachusetts and you don't know about that, get in touch with your Holmes Murphy rep. They'll talk to us. We'll talk to you. But otherwise, DC, New Jersey, Rhode Island, they're all using this. And then California uses this. And as I said, it's due by January 31st for your California residents. You want to get this out a little bit faster. All right. So that concludes kind of the bulk of it. For those of you that are able to hang out, we'll see what else we have in here. One of the first ones, our software always fills out part 3.
I just answered that.
We're fully insured. No, I would talk to the software folks and tell them to knock that off. That's going to be very confusing for the IRS. And it's actually probably an incorrect filing because you're indicating to them that you're self-insured. So we want to stop doing that. If you're not self-insured, generally you don't have to worry about the COBRA codes, with the exception of, I would say, just knowing that when someone terminates, that you're switching them over to that 1H 2A. If they weren't employed for you at any point during the year, but they're on COBRA, then you certainly don't worry about them. And then if they have a reduction in hours, then you still kind of need to know those COBRA codes, because you need to be able to assure the IRS this person wasn't in a stability period. They are a part-time employee. So if they went to the exchange and got a subsidy, even though previously they were reported as a full-time employee, now they're a part-time employee and we shouldn't be penalized. So remember, the bulk of part 2 of that 1095C is for employer mandate enforcement. And so we want to make sure that we're getting across to the IRS the full story for these employees. If the employee went from full-time to part-time and declined coverage, again, then we have to look at the facts. Were they in a stability period? If they were in a stability period, but then they dropped it, we probably need to make sure that we're still offering them affordable coverage based on their rate of pay, whatever it is. If they weren't in a stability period, but they remained eligible for your coverage, there you'd use that 2B code, right? You would be able to say, hey, we offer them coverage, we offer them COBRA, whatever, but they didn't take it. And we don't have to worry about being penalized because they weren't in a stability period. They're a part-time employee, so we'd report using 2B. Claire, I see that there were 30 answered while we were going through this. Were there any other questions that you saw pop up that were that may be good for those that are sticking around to hear?
Let me look real quick. One of the things I want us to reiterate is, remember, just because your employee has moved from full-time to part-time, because we are in the Affordable Care Act era, you are not automatically assuming that that employee is no longer entitled to coverage. If I'm a part-time, if I have moved from full-time to part-time and I have really worked enough hours that, let's say I've moved to from full-time to part-time in November and you have a calendar year plan year, I would not necessarily drop that person from coverage for the month of December.
Sure.
Yeah.
And Claire, I think we might debate one real quick here. I do believe if you hire someone in December and they were not a full-time employee for you in that month because they were in their waiting period, they're limited on assessment, I don't think you do have to generate a 1095C for that employee.
You know, the reason that I answered that one that way, Nick, is simply because most vendors that I am aware of are going to provide that, right? And I didn't want anybody freaking out because it does happen, right?
100%, and that's not a big deal. That one, it's not incorrect. It's not an incorrect filing. Yeah. It's.
So hang on, let me take a quick look. So Lisa did answer the employee hands on the 31st or postmark. And so properly addressed and mailed on or before the due date. So it is the post office, the post box rule. And then Lisa also answered the California question. Let's see, there's no penalty for failure to provide returns to individuals by this deadline. I think a lot of the questions that we had were really relative to what kind of codes am I putting in if I offer coverage, but my employee doesn't take it.
Yep. Again, look at what affordability safe harbor applies. That does kind of come into one of the questions that's open for us right now. If you're using the qualifying offer method, if you're using 1A on line 14, you can leave line 15 and line 16 blank. That is one of the few times where if you put that in there, then the IRS has been given all the information they need. You're offering more than affordable coverage. The employee spouse independent meets minimum value. You don't need anything in line 15, and you don't have to have a code in line 16. Similar to what Claire was talking about earlier, a lot of systems will default by putting information into line 16 especially, but they don't have to, and that's just fine.
Didn't mean line 15?
Well, nope, don't need anything in line 15. Line 15 can be left blank with when you're using 1A for 14. And then I would just, so if someone's getting a W-2, it does not necessarily mean that they're receiving a 1095C. You could have 3,000 part-time employees that never qualify as a full-time employee. When that's the case, there's no reason for you to report on them because they're not a reportable employee. They're not a full-time employee. You haven't offered them coverage or anything like that. So there's a good chance that you'll have individuals that you're providing a W-2 to that aren't reportable under the employer mandate.
Okay. I was told that if someone gets a W-2, they should have a 1095-C. That has been your rule of thumb. Renee, that's a really good rule. And in the beginning, when we first had these reports, you were supposed to send out your W-2 and your 1095-C at the same time. Since that time, the IRS has permanently relaxed the rules on that. So you don't have to get those two things out together, but it's awesome if you do. I don't want to discourage you from doing that. Do you have different thoughts, Nick?
No, that was what I was just talking about, where I just, if you have a part-time employee, they might receive a W-2, but they might not be reportable with a 1095-C.
Right. I got you. I thought this was a good one. Employee is in a stability period. They're out due to medical issues per their plan documents. They can't continue to be covered under the group plan. So we're not talking about FMLA. What code should I use?
Well, if you're offering them COBRA, then you're going with that COBRA thing. And if it's not an affordable offer of coverage, you might have a blank there. That's one where you might want to look at your eligibility language and your SPDs, and you might want to tweak that a little bit. Because if they're in a stability period, but they remain your employee, you have not terminated them as an employee. Generally, then you're supposed to continue to offer them affordable coverage.
So they're offered subsidized COBRA.
If you're offering subsidized COBRA, then generally, actually, you're not changing anything, right? You're still offering. You're making an offer of coverage. You're showing that it's a subsidized offer.
Then probably the only change there is you're putting whatever they're actually paying on line 15.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's still an offer of coverage. They've accepted it.
Yep, exactly. If the cost to them hasn't changed, beautiful. And then the last one here, we'll send out these slides. You'll have the key that we have on that slide. So you can look at it that way. It'll be going out with the recording as soon as we're done here. All right, that's what we have right now. Really appreciate all of you that stuck around for all of these questions. This is really complex stuff. I mean, as I was talking about this, I kind of had that thing in the back of my mind where I was like, man, if I was listening to this presentation, would I feel good about my reporting right now? I'm not so sure. But if you have additional questions, please reach out to your Holmes Murphy representative. They know how to get in touch with us. We're the nerds that love to talk about this stuff. It's our second language now, so we're happy to discuss it with you further. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. By the end of this week, just a reminder, you're going to receive this presentation, the Q&A, and the recording. So we will see you next month, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you.